So I've been seeing this thing pop up a lot lately. Not even something I was actively looking for, but it kept showing up in random places, forums, videos, people mentioning it like it's some kind of workaround for water issues. And at first I kind of ignored it, but then I started noticing the same pattern. People talking about water getting more expensive, restrictions, weird stuff with supply, especially in certain areas. So I ended up going down the rabbit hole a bit, and that's how I came across something called SmartWaterBox. And look, I'm not someone who's deep into off-grid stuff or anything like that, but water is one of those things you don't really think about until something feels off. Like when pressure drops for no reason, or you hear about restrictions, or you start thinking, what if this just stops working for a while? Not in a dramatic way, just inconvenient enough to mess everything up. And most of the usual solutions people talk about, they all seem a bit limited, like storing bottled water. Takes space, doesn't last forever rainwater. Depends on weather, plus set up wells. Expensive, not always possible. So yeah, I guess that's the kind of situation this thing is trying to fit into. From what I understood, Smart Water Box isn't really a product in the traditional sense. It's more like a guide, like instructions, blueprints, showing how to build a system that pulls water from the air, which sounds weird at first, honestly, but then you realize it's not that crazy. Like, dehumidifiers already do something similar, just not designed for drinking water. So the idea here seems to be taking that concept and turning it into something more intentional, a kind of DIY atmospheric water setup. I wasn't sure what to expect when I looked into it. I thought it was going to be super technical or something only engineers could understand. But from what I've seen, the whole point is actually the opposite. It tries to simplify things, like breaking down the system into basic parts, fans, coils, containers, stuff that's not exactly exotic, and then showing how they work together to collect condensation. So instead of thinking of it as building a machine, it's more like assembling a system step by step. At least that's how it's presented. What I found interesting is how it's supposed to be used. It's not something you just plug in and forget you actually build it first, obviously. And then it becomes something you can run as needed. Like it sits there, pulling moisture from the air over time and collecting it. So it's not instant, not like turning on a tap, more like a steady output depending on conditions, humidity, temperature, that kind of thing. And that's one thing I noticed pretty quickly. This kind of setup seems very dependent on context, like where you live. If the air is dry all the time, it probably won't perform the same way as in a more humid area. So yeah, it's not a universal solution. It's more like something that works better in certain environments and less in others. Another thing is it's DIY, which means it's not perfect. You're dealing with parts, assembly, adjustments. So I don't think it's for someone who just wants something ready out of the box. It's more for people who are okay figuring things out a bit, not in a complicated way, but still hands-on. What I did find kind of interesting, though, is that it doesn't try to replace everything. It's not positioned like this solves all your water needs forever. It feels more like an additional option, like something you can have as a backup, or even just to understand how these systems work. And I guess that's where it started making more sense to me, because if you think about it, most people rely entirely on one source. And when that works, it's fine. But when it doesn't, there's not much flexibility. So having something separate, even if it's small scale, might be useful depending on the situation. I also noticed they include stuff like materials lists, step-by-step instructions, and some notes about storage and purification, which makes sense because collecting water is one thing, but handling it properly is another. So it's not just about getting water, it's about making sure it's usable still. I had some doubts, like how consistent it actually is, how much water you realistically get, how much time it takes to build. And honestly, I think those are valid questions because this kind of thing isn't standardized. It depends on execution, environment, and expectations. So yeah, I wouldn't look at it as some kind of magic solution. It seems more like a practical system that works within certain limits and probably requires a bit of patience. As for who this makes sense for, I'd say people who are already thinking about this kind of stuff, not necessarily extreme situations, just people who don't like relying on a single system for everything, or who are curious about alternative setups, or even just like understanding how things work. If someone expects something automatic or effortless, this might not be it. but if they're okay with a bit of involvement, it could be interesting anyway. That's just what I gathered from looking into it. I didn't go into it expecting much, to be honest, but it ended up being one of those things that makes you think a bit differently about something you usually take for granted.